Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. Happy Friday. My name is Robert. This is the War of 1812 and the Star-Spangled Banner. Our good friend Deirdre O'Sullivan hosting us. So with that, I'll turn things over to Deirdre. Take it away. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. And again, I appreciate Robert allowing me to do things like this. So what we're going to be talking about today is the War of 1812 and the Star-Spangled Banner. Before we started playing the 1812 Overture, which is a lot of ironies because the 1812 Overture has nothing to do with the War of 1812. So that's kind of the irony of those two things. But if we actually go and anytime you do any sort of celebration, you're going to hear the 1812 Overture and you think, oh, what does that have to do with the War of 1812? And the answer, of course, is nothing. Tchaikovsky wrote the 1812 Overture in the 1880s. He wrote it to about the Russian War with Napoleon. It has nothing to do with the War of 1812, but he is the thing that is most remembered, which is just the irony of that is hilarious. Yeah, nothing, absolutely nothing to do with it. But again, we like to, we Americans hear a good tune, we run with it. So that is the reason why the War of 1812 is somehow associated with the 1812 Overture, even though one has nothing to do with the other. So let's go ahead and we'll go to the next page. So what are we going to talk about today? We're really going to talk about very briefly all of the things that are going on when the United States declares war against Great Britain. So what is going on in the world? What's going on with Napoleon? What is going on as far as the slave trade? There's a lot that's happening from the time in which the American Revolutionary War ends and the War of 1812 begins. We're not going to talk about any of these things in depth, but just to give you an understanding of what is going on in the world at the same time the United States decides to go to war with the UK. And I'm also going to use the words British and UK interchangeably. They both mean the same thing, and I'll show you kind of why that happens. So one of the first things that's going to happen is as soon as we decide to go to war against the UK, we also decide to try to capture Canada. So the US is going to make several attempts to invade Canada starting in 1812. None of them go very well. So eventually the empire is going to strike back and the British will invade both Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. They do pretty well in Washington, D.C., not so much in Baltimore. And then as far as the war in Baltimore, the Battle of Baltimore, then what's going to happen as a result of that is the drafting of the Star-Spangled Banner. We'll talk about that, what it means, and why it was written. And then finally, we'll talk about the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, and we'll talk about some of the winners and losers. So if we can go to the next slide. For those of you who are putting in comments, please know that I do have the chat room open and I don't have the Q&A open. It's just easier for me to try to track one than try to track both. So if you do have any comments or questions, please put them in the chat room so then I can see them. So I always like to start with the numbers. When the United States decided to declare war against the United Kingdom, what are the numbers? What are the population? And the population of the United States was a little bit under 8 million. And out of those, 1.1 million were slaves. Great Britain had a population of 15 million. The US Army had been shrunk. So it was a decent size under George Washington, but after George Washington and John Adams, we are then going to have Madison or Jefferson, and Jefferson is going to shrink the size of the army. And this is, of course, going to impact our ability to then take on the British in 1812. So when the war starts, we've got about 67,000 troops. Most of them are located on the frontier. And then about by the end of the war, we're going to have 35,000. So the British have about 4,000 troops in North America. By around the end of the war, we're going to have 48,000. But the British have almost 250,000 troops all over the world. So we have 6,700 troops. The British have almost 250,000. The disparity is enormous. We have 26 U.S. Navy ships. None of them are that impressive. They do get to be pretty good. Actually was recently on the USS Constitution, which was a more modern battleship, but the Royal Navy has 500 ships. So what are some of the casualties? Now, I went to different websites and everybody kind of had different casualty figures, so we're just going to have to assume that these are estimates. So the American casualties, we have 2,300 that are either killed by disease and about 8,000 due to other causes, about 4,500 are wounded, and about 20,000 are taken prisoners. And then we have the British or Canadian casualties. There's about 27,000 that are killed in battle and about 6,000 due to other causes. So again, it's hard to tell how many casualties there were. The figures again change depending on what sites you look at. So we're just going to go with estimates. So the question is did the U.S. have a standing army? And the answer is yes. It did have a standing army. I don't think it's ever not had a standing army. But again, most of that army was going to be used on the frontier against Native Americans. We also had forts that were being built starting in 1800 up and down the East Coast. And that's one of those forts are going to be Fort McHenry. And it is going to be manned. We also, as you can see, do have ships. So these are not necessarily privateer ships. These are ships assigned to the U.S. Navy. So yes, we did have a standing army. It was larger in 1800 than it was in 1812, but we did have a standing army. Next slide. So let's talk about, again, this timeline of important events in U.S., French, and British history. Well, it's hard to describe, but causes can be, people can die in accidents, people die in between battles. So people don't necessarily die on a battlefield, but again, as the army is waiting for different battles to happen, people die of horse accidents. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why people could die, not necessarily in battle or as a result of battle. So let's talk about this timeline. Now, again, I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. It's just a general idea as to what's going on in the world. So in 1887, the United States ratifies the American Constitution. 1788, George Washington is elected as the first U.S. president. 1789, the French Revolution begins. By 1793, the French king has been executed. Great Britain and the newly created French Republic are now at war. 1796, John Adams, who was the vice president under George Washington, is now elected as the second president of the United States. Congress passes legislation to counteract the threat to American soldiers being oppressed into the service into the British Navy. This is not successful. So the war starts obviously between Great Britain and between Great Britain and the French. They need more soldiers. And so they're basically stopping American ships, listening to people's accents. If you have an accent that sort of sounds British and they need, for example, a quartermaster, or they need a sailor, or they need a boatswain, whatever the role is, and they need it, they basically just take people off the ships and they have officially joined the British Navy. So this becomes a real problem for the Americans because they're losing very experienced sailors, and they don't like that. So they're not attacking U.S. Navy ships. They're attacking American merchant ships and basically taking the soldiers or the sailors that they need at that particular moment. They try to counteract it. The British are not impressed with whatever the Americans are trying to do. In 1799, Napoleon, who is a commander in the French army, I'm going to do that all the time, French, British. Napoleon is definitely French. He is a commander in the French army, and he's going to become the first consul of the French Republic. Next slide. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson is elected the third U.S. president, and this is a very contested election. It's really kind of one of the first. Adams thought he was going to get 2 terms. He did not. Instead, he was defeated by Thomas Jefferson, who was at one point one of his really good friends. So this is all 1800 is a big contested election for the United States. In the meantime, back in Europe, between 1800 and 1801, most of the Italian peninsula is going to fall to the French. 1801, the United Kingdom is founded. So we refer to them as the British Army or the British Navy, but officially Great Britain is now going to be referred to as the UK or United Kingdom. So in 1808, 1800 to 1802, the UK is going to dictate new rules for neutral countries who are conducting maritime trade with France. So the United States has a lot of natural resources. The UK is at war with France. So a lot of natural resources are coming from the United States and are helping in the French war effort. So they are going to do what they can to stop that. And they are going to dictate rules to the United States on how they're going to conduct trade with France. Again, violating what the US considers our ability to do trade and who we want to trade with, that the UK is interfering with that. In 1803, the US formalizes the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, and the United States has now doubled in size. So prior to that, kind of the United States ended, they kind of ended at the Mississippi River. So now we have territory west of the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi is now becoming a dividing point of the United States. And so we have new territory west of the Mississippi, and yet there are territories within, kind of east of the Mississippi, that are still considered on the frontier. So this is way out beyond where we thought we would go. 1804, Napoleon becomes the Emperor of France. In 1805 is the Battle of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I'm not even going to bother. Napoleon is going to defeat the armies of both Russia and Austria. In 1805 is the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, this is a big deal because this is really, the French had been contesting the role that the British had of the largest navy in the world, and the British are going to defeat the French, and they're going to maintain their dominance of having the largest navy in the world really through till World War I. Next slide. Well, the Americans' greatest trading partner. So the question is how close to U.S. shores were British ships when taking American sailors? They were really doing it almost in kind of London Harbor, because the Americans' greatest trading partner was the UK. So we had ships constantly going back and forth between Boston and Baltimore and other places to the UK. They were our greatest trading partners. So we had ships constantly going back and forth, and they were harassed even trying to ship items even to the UK, let alone when they ended up going into France, then they were basically being hit, not hit, but they were being intercepted on their way back and forth. So in 1806, the French army is going to invade Poland. In 1806, both the French and the British are going to, now they're going to both start interfering. So the French and the British are now going to start putting mandates in place for neutral countries as they are trying to trade with either one of them. So the British are trying to stop the Americans from trading with France. France is trying to stop the Americans from trading with Britain. Either way, we're not having a good time with any of this. So as a result, in 1807, the U.S. adopts the Embargo Act. And this idea is we're going to stop trading with both of them, and that's going to punish them. It didn't. Instead, it really hurt the U.S. Economically, and in the end, we did overturn that. In 1807 is the Slave Trade Act, and the British are going to end the international slave trade. The United States follows suit, and in 1808, they prohibit the new slaves from being imported into the United States. 1809, James Madison will become the 4th U.S. president. 1811, the British Prince of Wales becomes the King Regent. So the Prince of Wales is now the head of the UK, who has now been replaced, for lack of a better word. So who was the king that was there until 1811? So anyone to put in the chat room who was the king who was replaced by the British Prince of Wales? George. That's a very good. Yeah, George III. And what is he referred to as? It's referred to as Mad King George. That is something in which that also begins the area, but is known as the Regency. So for those of you who, study history and you think about when they talk about, clothes of the Regency or styles of the Regency, a lot of that kind of begins right around this time period when the British Prince of Wales does become the regent, and he becomes in facto the king of the UK. Next slide. So in 1812, Napoleon is going to invade Russia. He is going to get as far as Moscow, but then he has to turn back. So he is going to take 100,000 of his Grand Army into Russia. When he returns to France, he will return to France with only 10,000 of them. So 90% of all the troops he brings with him into Russia, only 10,000 will ever return to France. In 1812, President Madison is going to ask Congress for a declaration of war against the UK. 1813, Napoleon is going to be defeated by a coalition of the Prussian, Austrian, and Russian forces at the Battle of Leipzig. I think I said that right. In 1814, Napoleon is going to abdicate the throne and he's going to be sent to the island of Elba. 1814, the British Army, along with the naval forces, will be sent to Washington, D.C., and later into Baltimore. 1814 to 1850 is the Congress of Vienna. They're going to meet to discuss the new boundaries of Europe. So Napoleon has basically taken Europe. So he has taken everything from Spain to Italy to Poland to Austria, and he made it all the way to Moscow. So what we're going to do now is we're going to redraw all of those boundaries, and they are going to all be decided at the Congress of Vienna that starts in 1814. But when the Congress of Vienna is actually still going on, we're going to have the Battle of Waterloo. So in 1815, Napoleon is going to leave the island of Elba, return back to France, and he is going to start recreating his army. The king who was in charge at the time, he's going to flee, and there is going to be one more major battle of Napoleonic War, and that is going to be in Belgium, in the small town of Waterloo. And eventually Napoleon will be defeated from a one-day battle from the combined armies of the British, the Persians, the Dutch, and the Germans will finally defeat Napoleon, hence ending the Napoleonic Wars. So in the middle of all of this, the Americans are going to decide to go to war with the UK. We're going to talk a lot more about how that all happened. But I wanted to give you some context of what is going on in Europe when the Americans decide to do this. Next slide. So we're going to talk about kind of the pathway to war, and the person whose name is going to come up over and over again is going to be James Madison. So if you can put in the chat room what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about James Madison. What words come to your mind? What kind of the things in which he done? What is he famous for? If you can, yes, exactly. So somebody put down the father of the Constitution. He has his wife Dolly. We're going to talk about her. He did some other things. Anyone else want to mention some of the things in which he did? Madison versus Marlborough. That is correct. That's a very important aspect because that is going to establish the precedent in which the Supreme Court can overturn legislation that has been passed and declare it unconstitutional. He is also, he's a key theologian for all the U.S. Government documents. Manifest Destiny is another one. He also contributed to the ratification of the Constitution by writing several of the Federalist Papers. We're going to talk about Dolly saving some documents in the White House. Very important. There's a school in New York City that's known as James Madison. There are a lot of towns named Madison, especially in Ohio, for example. There's also, again, you can go to his home, the Federalist Papers. Now, for those of you who have seen Hamilton, this is kind of an aspect that people don't think of as much. So when you watch the musical Hamilton, it isn't until the second act that Madison comes into place. So who does Madison kind of partner up with in the musical Hamilton? So he is a very key figure in writing the Constitution. We're going to talk about that. But who is his partner in crime? Starting in around 1888, the president George Washington becomes the president, and he is then going to be involved in kind of every policy dispute that is going to occur during the presidency of George Washington. He is going to partner with Jefferson, correct. So if we think about today's political parties, some people have let it gone back to these kind of the partnership between Madison and Jefferson. And then on the other side is going to be Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And they're going to be the Federalist Party. And then over here, we're going to have Madison and Jefferson start the Democratic Republican Party, as was referred to at the time. So he is going to have a major role in not only shaping the United States with the writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but he's also going to be a major player in basically creating policies that are going to be implemented under George Washington. And then eventually he is going to be part of the creating of, he's going to be the third president of the United States, and it's under his leadership that we go to war in 1812. So he's a major player in the establishment of the United States and a lot of the policies that we come up with. And as somebody pointed out, he is also a large slaveholder. That is correct. We're going to talk about that as well. Madison was not really interested in a strong central government. That's not actually where he was going. He was much more in line with Jefferson, who really believed that a small, limited government was the way to go. All right, so let's go start talking about Madison. Next slide. Next slide. So Madison was born in March of 1751 in the colony of Virginia. His father was a wealthy landowner who owned approximately 100 slaves. He's going to attend Princeton in New Jersey, and he is the shortest president at 5'4". He was involved in drafting the Virginia State Constitution and was elected to the Second Continental Congress in 1780. So it was in the Second Continental Congress in 1776 where they drafted the Declaration of Independence. So he was not involved in that. He actually was elected later in 1780. So the war ends in 1783. And then we have the Articles of Confederation that are passed. And the Articles of Confederation, it's determined within a couple of years that it's not working, that we actually have states that are about to go to war with each other. Everybody's printing their own money. There is a lot of confusion as to who is in charge, and the decision is made that maybe we need to come up with a better plan. So James Madison is going to sit at his desk at Montpelier, and he is going to develop the first draft of the U.S. Constitution. Now, Montpelier is located in Virginia. So, not Southern Virginia, but we'll just call it middle of Virginia. He is going to leave there on his way to Philadelphia, and he's going to stop at Mount Vernon. When he is at Mount Vernon, he's going to show George Washington his draft of the new U.S. Constitution. So George Washington, when he arrives in Philadelphia, is going to immediately be elected as the president of the Constitution Convention. And he is then going to present James Madison's plan for the new U.S. Constitution. So it is James Madison's plan. He presents it to George Washington. George Washington presents it to the group. Now, everybody's going to take what George Washington has presented, and that is going to be used as the foil. Basically, this is the plan. We're going to make some changes along the way, but most of what James Madison has came up with is eventually going to be voted on and is going to become the new U.S. Constitution. So he also then wrote some of the Federalist Papers. For those of you who remember from the musical Hamilton, there are multiple Federalist Papers that are written. Some of them are going to be written by Madison, and some of the most important ones are going to be written by Madison. It's really going to be in defense of this new Constitution that he helped draft. And eventually the Constitution does get passed, and George Washington is going to be elected as the first president. He will then be elected to Congress. And one of the first things he's going to do is he's going to draft and he's going to get past the Bill of Rights. Now, those are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So when we talk about, I have First Amendment rights, that was written by James Madison. So James Madison not only wrote the Constitution, but he also wrote the first of the 10 amendments to the Constitution, and he got them passed through that first Congress. That was in 1889, I believe he started, and then he got it passed within a couple of months of that. And then he's going to partner with Thomas Jefferson, and they have very similar ideas as to how this new government should be shaped. And it is going to be Jefferson and it's going to be Madison who are going to, because remember, you can't get anything passed in Congress without Madison. So eventually Hamilton is going to figure that out, and he's going to have to work with Madison if he wants to get anything through Congress. So he has a tremendous amount of influence as to and of the shaping of our country. Next slide. So in 1793, the US is going to face its first international crisis when the French and the British go to war. And as a result of this, the UK is going to start impressing US soldiers and seizing American ships who are trading with French colonies. So this is an enormous crisis for this new country that has no money, barely has a government that functions, and they're still trying to figure out what the heck they're going to do next. As a result of this, Washington actually manages to secure a treaty with Britain through, it's called the Jay Treaty. John Jay gets it passed. And this really does not make Madison happy. Madison really thinks that, that this whole thing about, that the British are basically dissing us, that they are not respecting our sovereignty, which they weren't. And this is something we really need to take on. And Washington's like, we are so not ready for another war. We are barely holding on as it is. We are not ready to do this. So the Jay Treaty really buys us some time. So the question in the chat room is, why did the UK and France go to war? And the answer is because they executed the French king. Obviously, both France and the UK had kings. They had monarchies. And the French decided to get rid of their monarchy. And the British basically decided that this could upset kind of the whole world order. And they've already gone through this with the Americans. They don't want to do it again. And so they go to war with France. So that's really what it's about. In 1794, James Madison marries Dolly Payne Todd. She is a widow from Philadelphia. Remember, the capital is in Philadelphia. So he is spending a lot of time in the capital, and he meets Dolly Todd, and they do get married fairly quickly after meeting. In 1796, John Adams is going to be elected the second U.S. president. Now, most people think that the first contested election is actually 1800, but kind of way behind the scenes, there is movement by both Madison and Jefferson to try to figure out how not to get Adams as president. They don't want Adams to be president in 1796, and they're doing things kind of behind the scenes to see if they can stop it. They can't, but the elements are there to try to give it a shot. It's their first chance. They don't do very well. They get better at it. So by 1800, both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson are trying to figure out how they're going to make Thomas Jefferson president. So even starting in 1799, they're already campaigning is maybe not the right word, but manipulating things behind the scenes to make sure that people know that Jefferson is willing to be president and that it is not necessary that John Adams get a second term. So really it was Thomas Jefferson and Adams really, they wanted power, and they really didn't think that the Federalist Party, which was the party of George Washington and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, were going in the right direction. They thought that the Democratic Republican Party was. So they were trying to manipulate things so that John Adams would not be elected president. They were unsuccessful, but in 1800 they were. So it may have been an automatic thing, everybody gets 2 terms. Instead, in 1800, John Adams did not get 2 terms, and Thomas Jefferson was elected president. And then he immediately appoints as his Secretary of State, James Madison. So also in 1801, Madison's father dies, and he is going to inherit the large plantation of Montpelier in Virginia, along with 100 slaves. Next slide. So in 1803, kind of the next big thing that's going to happen is that Jefferson and Madison, because Madison again is the Secretary of State, he is going to send James Monroe to France in order to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans. They're going to offer $3 million to Napoleon for the purchase of New Orleans, which of course is at the base of the Mississippi River. Instead, Napoleon counteracts their offer and says he will give them the entire Louisiana Purchase for $15 million. And this, of course, is going to double the size of the United States. Now, there's a huge, James Monroe takes the deal before he even comes back. So Jefferson is like, wait a minute, I'm not sure that we want to increase the size of the government. I don't know if we have the ability to do this under the Constitution. There are a lot of different reasons as to why Jefferson is not so sure about all of this. It is Madison who talks him into it. So the negotiation goes through, the purchase is made, and as a result, the United States has now doubled in size. And it's also in more debt because of the $15 million purchase that it has made, which was a lot of money in 1803. In 1805, tensions with the UK are going to intensify. So there was a treaty made in 1794, which was the Jay Treaty, which kind of ended a lot of the impressions of US soldiers. But by 1805, this is all going to start up again. So there is going to be more impressing of US soldiers, and there's going to be more seizing of US goods that are heading to France. Madison believes that economic pressure alone would basically influence both the British and the French to start leaving our merchant ships alone. It doesn't work. So Congress is going to pass the Embargo Act of 1807, and that's going to ban all exports to all foreign nations. The idea is that they need our raw materials, so they will come to the table. It didn't work that way. We needed their finished goods more than they needed our raw materials. So there was an imbalance of power that Madison really didn't understand, and for that matter, a lot of people in Washington didn't understand. But they figured it out very quickly when it really started hurting US interests a lot more than it did theirs. Because remember, both France and the UK have colonies, and they can get raw materials from their colonies. They don't necessarily need them from the United States. It helps, but it wasn't vital to them the way it was vital to our interest to have products from both France and from the UK. So eventually the Embargo Act is going to be overturned because it's a complete disaster for the United States. Now, under the Jefferson term, which is of course 1801 to 1809, he is going to reduce the size of both the Army and the Navy. And there are several reasons for this. One, he's not a huge proponent of a strong central government. And in addition to that, the United States has some debts, and they have just, of course, got new debts when they purchased the Louisiana Purchase. So he is leaving the Army smaller, and he is going to reduce it. So one of the questions came in about the status of the US and Europe at the time. It's a little confusing. The first country that is really going to act is going to be the UK. And that is going to be in 1807. They're going to ban the international slave trade. So that means that British ships can no longer be used to transport slaves from Africa to anywhere, not only to the United States, but really anywhere. And about 40% of all of the slaves that were taken from Africa at the time and brought to the New World, we'll call it, came from British ships. So that's going to end very abruptly. And then the United States is going to end the international slave trade in 1809. So that means that the United States will no longer accept international or slaves from Africa. So the domestic slave trade will continue, but there will no longer be incoming slaves from Africa. I think France does something similar pretty soon after that. And so the international slave trade, or the what they call the Atlantic slave trade, that will come to an end for the most part around 1810. Now, obviously, the United States will maintain its slaves up through the 1863 and the end of the Civil War. And but the British will end it much earlier in both the UK and in their territories. I apologize, I don't know the exact year that happens. And the French will eventually do the same. So one of the comments here is Madison's propaganda of the manifest destiny sowed the seeds for the total expansion to North America. We are not going to spend a lot of time talking about the indigenous, the Native Americans. We're going to talk about it eventually. But as far as Madison, I think that most Americans believed in manifest destiny. It wasn't just Madison. The idea that the America should eventually go from coast to coast. But America not only had Native Americans who were living in, in obviously in the entire United States, but you had French colonies, you had the French territory, you had territory that was owned by Spain, so you had Spanish. immigrants in and around Texas to California. So there were a lot of different factors that basically, were pushing at the time. But the United States really ended at the Mississippi until the Louisiana Purchase. But we barely even understood kind of at the time what was even there. One of the things that also came about was the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that was set up by Jefferson. And the idea was, let's just see what's out there. And they managed to make it all the way to the coast, and then more importantly, they made it back to St. Louis. Okay, let's try to the next slide. Okay, so in 1809, Madison is going to become the 4th president of the United States. At the same time, the tensions with France are going to ease, but the tensions with the UK are just escalating. In the meantime, there have been several congressmen who have now been elected, and they are known as the War Hawks. They're pushing for, quote, a second war of independence. In addition to that, they also want to seek and capture Canada, the territory of Canada. Basically, there are people who have decided that, Louisiana Purchase isn't enough. We also should get Canada. That's what the thinking was at the time. On June 1st, 1812, Madison is going to request Congress do a declaration of war, stating his chief grievances with the British, including the impressment of U.S. sailors, the rejecting of America's claim of neutrality in trade, and the arming of Native American tribes on the frontier. Again, these are the three major reasons why. In essence, it all kind of comes down to the issues at sea. There are obviously a lot of merchants who keep the American economy afloat by taking raw material from the United States, bringing it to Europe, and taking European goods, finished goods, back to the United States. And this is almost what's propping up our economy. And the disruption of that has caused major problems all up and down the East Coast. And this is the idea that the British are not respecting our ability to trade with whoever we think is best. And so that's one of the major reasons why Madison does decide to go to war. Now, the other issue with Madison is he never served in the war. He was a politician during the war. He did multiple things during the war. He obviously wrote the U.S. Constitution, but he never served. And for that matter, neither did Jefferson. So I think they both had this idea that taking on the British would be fairly simple with us going to war. And it wasn't. It was never going to be simple, but there was a certain belief that, we'd beaten them once, we could beat them again. Somebody brought up the issue of arming the Native Americans. That was an issue. The Americans obviously claimed the land up until kind of the Canadian border, and yet a lot of those tribes didn't really have the same borders that we had created. And so you had tribes that kind of spilled over. You had people who were going to the, and they were kind of just harassing. They were arming the Native Americans to harass the Americans. And it worked. And the Americans didn't like it. So there was an issue involving that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm not really going to talk about the Native Americans during this time frame because it would take over the whole presentation. So the Declaration of War barely passed. We always think of declarations of war like in World War II, it was almost unanimous. And this was not. And there was a lot of opposition from congressmen from the Northeast who were really concerned about how the war was going to impact their trading. And they were right. It was going to have a huge impact. Next slide. So we are going to talk about the invasion of Canada, and kind of one of the bright spots for the Americans was when Commodore Oliver Perry met the British fleet in the Great Lakes and basically defeated them. And he sent a message to Washington. The message was very simple. It said, quote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Next slide. Now we're going to talk about this fairly briefly. There's a lot happens, and I'm not going into any of it in a lot of detail. So in 1812, Canada had around 500,000 inhabitants, or let me rephrase, 500,000 British inhabitants or non-Indigenous people. So it's not that big, and 2/3 of them are French speakers who live in Quebec. So the the territory of Canada was not very big, was a huge territory, but obviously most of its inhabitants really just kind of lived along the border with the United States. The US Army was very small. It had 6,700 men. And even then, a lot of when they tried to pull up some of the militias, most of the militias were very, very weary of leaving their states. Why would they have militias in places like Tennessee or Ohio or Pennsylvania? Why did they need militias in these states? Why were they created? It wasn't to fight against the British. Why did you need a militia in some place like Tennessee or Kentucky? Anyone want to put it in the chat room? Why Kentucky or Tennessee? You know, that's a very good question. So the question is why did the French and Canada support our invasion? We'll talk about that. The reason why we needed the militia was really to, because people were very concerned about the Native Americans and or attacks against the Native Americans. So they were much more concerned about that, and the idea that you were going to take militias from places like Tennessee and Pennsylvania to invade Canada. They were afraid that they were leaving their own states vulnerable. So that was something that they were very weary of. But still, in July of 1812, U.S. General William Hull is going to cross the Detroit River into Canada with his army, and it did not go as planned. A month later, Hull is going to surrender Fort Detroit to the British and their Native American allies. Hull is going to be replaced by General William Henry Harris. Who is William Henry Harris and why is he famous? So if I said that William Henry Harris, who is that? Who do you think that is? So somebody said that we need a militia for the slave trade. I'd say that that's probably correct, but I do think that the more concern at the time was the Native American threat than it was of a slave uprising. It was certainly existed, but I think it was much more the Native Americans. Yes, actually, he's not the shortest. Yes, exactly. The president who died soon after his inauguration. So William Henry Harrison was a general in the 1812 war, and he would become president of the United States in 1840. He also defeated Tecumseh, correct. He had the shortest presidential term. I want to say it was about 33 days. I think after he did his inaugural speech, he did die of pneumonia. Also, then the following year, in April of 1860, another American army is going to invade Canada via the Niagara, and it too does not go according to plan. Next slide. So in September of 1840, the U.S. Navy will defeat the British Navy in the Battle of Lake Erie. This is really one of the bright spots for the Americans, and it allows the U.S. to maintain control of the lake. So they actually built ships in Lake Erie. They've built like 5 of them, and they were able to use those 5 ships to defeat the French. I'm sorry, to defeat the British Navy, who had, decided to try to control the lake. So again, most of the fighting in 1812 to 1814 is going to be along that frontier with Canada. And kind of it's going to go back and forth. It is going to be the Americans are going to try to invade, they're going to be pushed back, and then they're going to try again, and then they're going to be pushed back, and then they're going to try again, and then they're going to be pushed back again. So it's this back and forth over this territory, and one of the bright spots for the Americans is going to be when they defeat the British Navy at the Battle of Lake Erie. So once again, 1813, General Harris is going to invade Canada, and they're going to defeat the British and their Native American allies at the Battle of the Thames. The Americans once again will control the city or the fort. And then it was a fort, but eventually become the city of Detroit. In 1813, they will make more attempts, this time for Montreal. Again, they will be unsuccessful. But the tide is really going to turn in 1814. What has happened in Europe that has enabled the British to turn their attention to the Americans? What happened in Europe in 1814? So the war in America, but for the British, has just been a distraction because the main war is going on in Europe. But in 1814, something is going to happen that is going to enable them to turn their attention back to the Americans. And of course, it is going to be Napoleon is going to be defeated. And on top of that, he's going to be exiled. So he is going to abdicate his throne and he is going to go to the island of Elba. And yes, and the Americans, the Canadians are very proud of their defeat of this US invasion. One of the questions was asked is why didn't the French support our invasion of our invasion of Canada? And the answer is they had much bigger issues to deal with than what was going on in the United States. Waterloo didn't happen until we're going to talk about that. Waterloo is 1815. We are still in 1814. So the Americans are now in trouble because all of these battle-hardened British troops are now on their way and they have no idea what's about to hit them. So the Americans are going to pull their troops out of Canada. They're going to hold on to the US territories along the Canadian border, but for the most part, by the summer of 1814, they have moved all of their troops basically back over the river, and now they are in the United States. So saying that the bulk of the US Army is located on that frontier with Canada. The British Army have the British Navy, which is the most powerful in the world. They can go anywhere, which has left the entire East Coast now vulnerable to an attack by the British Army and the British Navy. And the Americans have left their new capital defenseless. Next slide. So the Empire strikes back. So we're going to talk about what happens in the summer of 1814 when the Empire strikes back. One of the quotes here is from Dolly Madison, and she writes a letter to her sister on the 24th. It talks about what is happening that day, and it also says, quote, "I insist on waiting until the large picture of General Washington is secure." We're going to talk about that. The French citizens of Canada basically decide that, yeah, they don't want to be invaded either. Invasion just is not good. So they don't really care who's coming, but anyone who decides to come in and invade, then you do the siege and then you do the destruction. Invasions are ugly, and they decide that they want no part of it. They want no part of allowing the Americans to come in and seize. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about the Battle of Bladensburg. In April of 1814, Napoleon has abdicated and is exiled to the island of Elba. The British can turn their attention to the Americans. Now, the British commanders are under very strict instructions. They're told that they should not take or hold territory. Their idea is they're just going to harass them. We're just going to punish the Americans for dragging us into this in the first place. But the idea is we're not going to take the British Army and hold places. That's not really what we're trying to do. We just want to punish them. We're just going to cause a bunch of trouble. But this, of course, is open to interpretation. So on August 24th, 1814, the British forces are going to land near Bladensburg, Maryland. This is kind of outside of Washington, D.C. There are 5,000 members of the American Army who are there to defend the city. Now, they're mostly made up of militia, but they have an advantage. They're twice the size of the British Army. But yeah, they don't do very well. They get hit with these brand new rockets. Their lines get flanked, and the American line just collapses. And you have thousands of American soldiers who are basically flooding into Washington, D.C., and announcing that the city is about to fall. That's a very interesting question. Would the war strategy have been so poor if George Washington had been alive? I don't know the answer to that question, because George Washington died in 1799, and this would have been 14 years later. So the technology is slightly different. I don't know if George Washington would have advocated or actually wanted a war with Great Britain. He was pretty adamant that the United States, we didn't want to do this again, that our chances of winning a second time were not great. So I don't see him I don't know, allowing for it, but advocating for it in the first place. But I don't know what his role would have been. Again, if he had been alive, he would have been fairly old, so I don't know how much of an impact he would have been. We are going to talk about the portrait in a moment. So they're going to get hit with these new rockets, and their lines are going to be flanked. So instead of coming at them directly, the British are going to come at them from two sides, and they're just going to collapse. George Madison actually was at the battle to observe it, and he was unable then to return to Washington, D.C. He's basically caught on the wrong side of the river. And the British are going to enter what we call the Federal City, which is what Washington, D.C. was known as at the time. Next slide. So these are the rockets. So the rockets were first developed by the Indians in India in the late 1780s. Now, a British by the name of Congreve, he is basically going to take the design. So it's used in India against British troops. The British troops basically capture some of these rockets, bring them back to London. So Congreve is going to find whatever rockets he can have that were designed by the Indians, and he's going to play with it. And he's going to basically figure out how he can take this rocket and make it go 1,500 yards, which is a lot further than anyone else has come up with before. And then he's going to sell these rockets with the design for the rockets to the British Army and the Navy. The rockets are then going to be used against the Americans at the Battle of Bladensburg and again in Baltimore. Now you can see these are fairly terrifying. They're very practical because they're light. So you can put them on ships and they're not going to change the ballast of the ship. They are lighter than cannons. You can actually move more rockets around than you can cannons and the cannonballs. And then when they light them off, they make this terribly loud noise, and they're just terrifying. So they're more of a terror weapon than they are necessarily a weapon that is going to be used to influence a battle, but except at Bladensburg. But they're also very inaccurate. And also they have a tendency of exploding upon launching. So as you can see from this picture here, this guy, he's standing there, he has lit the flames, and basically the rocket takes off. But sometimes when you light the flame, it just goes boom. So it can explode basically upon being lit. And of course, it can take out all the soldiers who are trying to light it and use it against the enemy. Instead, it's blowing up in their faces. So it was a terror weapon, not only against the Americans, but some of the British found them to be terrible as well, because they were both inaccurate and they could be very deadly just to launch. Next slide. So as the Americans are fleeing through Washington, D.C., they're going to burn the Washington Naval Yard, and they're even going to destroy some of their own ships that are located at that harbor. Now, the British are going to enter the city of Washington, D.C., and they had orders to burn all the public or federal buildings, but only the federal and the public buildings. So in other words, they're supposed to leave private property alone. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to find the U.S. Capitol, and they're going to burn it. Inside the U.S. Capitol is kind of one major building. You've got the Library of Congress and the Supreme Court are all in this one complex, which is really still under construction. It's going to be under construction all the way through the Civil War, and they're going to make different changes to it. But the whole thing is going to be burned as a result of the British arriving. Next, they literally run down Constitution Avenue, and they're going to find the White House. Now, before they arrive, Dolly Madison is going to receive a message from her husband telling her it is time to flee. But she is hesitating. She is waiting for James Madison to come back to the White House to collect her. In the meantime, she actually sets dinner. She's setting up a dinner table for basically not only the president, but his cabinet, because most of his cabinet went with him to the Battle of Bladensburg. So she has had dinner set on the table, waiting for him to return. It is not until Major Charles Carroll shows up and says, Dolly, we got to go. We got to go. So she basically has her servants packing up stuff, getting ready to go. And she starts loading stuff into her carriage and into his wagon. And then she realizes she sees in the large frame and picture of George Washington. This is the one done by Gilbert Stuart. And that's the one we have on the dollar bill. So she realizes that if the British get a hold of this, they will destroy it. So she They try to take it down. They can't take it down. It's nailed to the wall. They don't have the proper tools. She says, rip it out. So they rip up the frame. They pull it out of the frame and roll it up. And it's actually given to two other gentlemen who have showed up to try to help her get out of the city. She ends up going with Carol to his estate, which is located near Georgetown. She is not in the city when the British arrive. However, when the British arrive, they find a table all set with alcohol. They're very happy with it. Next slide. So first thing the British are going to do is they're going to eat the dinner, which has been prepared by Dolly Madison for the president and his cabinet. They're very happy to have found this. They're also going to, loot. They're going to try to take anything that they can get their hands on. But a lot of the more expensive things have been removed by Dolly Madison. Not only did she remove the portrait of George Washington, but she also took with her a copy of the Declaration of Independence. A copy, not the copy, a copy. And she takes it with her in her carriage. So what the British are going to do is they're going to break all of the windows on the first floor of the White House. And then they're going to take all the furniture and they're going to kind of put it into the center of the room, break it, put it in the center of the room. And then they're going to take long spears and they're going to wrap them with oil kind of at the end, paper or cloth. They're going to soak that with oil, wrap that to the end of the pole, and then stick the poles through the windows, trying to hit the pile of furniture, which is in the middle of the room. It works brilliantly. Boom, the whole thing goes up. And they get very excited and they're able to watch the White House burn. The next day, they actually burn the Treasury building, the State Department building, the War Department building, and other public buildings in Washington, D.C. Next slide. However, that same day, the day after they burned down the White House and the Capitol, a freak storm comes through Washington, D.C. There have been, I think, 4 recorded tornadoes in all of Washington, D.C. The first one that's ever been recorded was literally the day in which the British tried to burn it down. So this puts out the fires, and it also manages to damage multiple of the British ships. So at one point, a tornado actually goes down Constitution Avenue and lifts 2 cannons, the British cannons, off the ground, and it kills multiple British soldiers and a couple of American civilians. Now, the occupation of Washington only lasts 26 hours. So in that 26 hours, they have managed to burn the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury building, the State Department, and the War Department. All of those buildings have been burned as a result of the British being in Washington, but it is a very quick visit and a very quick occupation. 26 hours later, they are out of here. So they have taken over Washington, D.C. They've only been there for 26 hours. They're getting back on their boats or they are journeying north to Baltimore. Either way, they have left Washington, D.C. within 26 hours of arriving. They also go to Alexandria, Virginia, but the mayor kind of makes a deal with them and they do not burn down Alexandria, Virginia. Next slide. So the next thing that's going to happen is they are going to try to take Baltimore. Baltimore is a very important harbor city, and it is very important for the trade of the United States. And then we're going to talk about Francis Scott Key and his poem, Defense of Fort McHenry. Next slide. So in September 12th, the British Army lands at the North Port in Baltimore, where they meet a much better trained militia under Major General Samuel Smith. Now, Samuel Smith has spent almost the last 6 months training the forces that are going to be defending Baltimore. He has a really good idea that they're coming for him because the Chesapeake Bay is a very large and very important piece of American history. And throughout kind of 1814, the British Navy, some ships have been coming up and down the Chesapeake Bay, burning towns, lighting things on fire, and just kind of harassment up and down the coast. So the Baltimore is pretty prepared for the fact that eventually they're coming for them. They're too big of a target for the British to ignore forever. So as a result of this, they're going to start doing defenses in and around Baltimore. And in addition to that, they're going to start training. And they're basically every able-bodied man is going to belong to the militia, and they are going to start training under Samuel Smith. And he is going to train them, and he's going to train them well. And they're going to be pretty prepared when the British finally do arrive. So the first place they arrive is at Northport. I'll show you a map to make it a little easier to understand, in Baltimore. And there's going to be, for lack of a better word, a little skirmish. The British are not prepared for how well they rolled over the Americans in Washington. They were prepared to roll over the Americans in Baltimore, and they just didn't. It just didn't work out that way. So instead, the Major General Robert Ross, he was the guy who burned Washington, D.C., he's going to be killed in this minor little skirmish outside of Baltimore. He was also a big hero of the Napoleonic Wars, and he will be killed by the Americans outside of Baltimore. The Americans are going to kind of lose that skirmish, and instead they're going to retreat behind the city's defenses. And once the British realize how serious these defenses are, they are going to rethink their strategy. So instead, they're going to use the world's largest navy, and they're going to attack Baltimore that way. So they're going to use this massive fleet, and they're going to use this to take the city. But guarding the entrance of the city of the inner harbor is Fort McHenry. It would need to be taken out first. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a modern map of Baltimore. But when you look at it, things start making a little bit more sense. So if you look kind of in the middle left-hand corner or right-hand corner is Fort McHenry. Now that is the entrance then to the inner harbor. On the right of Fort McHenry is the outer harbor. To the left of Fort McHenry is the inner harbor. And the inner harbor is where Baltimore exists. So all around kind of the defenses from Fort McHenry kind of up through downtown and Fells Point, there are defenses that have been set up with 100 cannon. So the British realized that if we're going to try to take it by land, we're going to have too many casualties, and that's not worth it to us. So instead, we're going to take this huge navy we have, we're going to go past Fort McHenry, we're going to enter into the inner harbor, we're just going to start bombing everything, and then they will surrender, which they probably would have, because it would have destroyed the city. But in order to get into the inner harbor, you have to get past Fort McHenry first. And here lies the problem. Fort McHenry was built around 1800. It is a very well-built fort, and it is commanded by somebody who knows what they're doing. Next slide. So George Armistead is the commander of Fort McHenry. He has been a successful soldier in the United States, and he has been handpicked by Madison to be the commander of Fort McHenry. I think he had at least 3 other brothers, and they all served in the American Army. It's a very famous family in the United States. So one of the things he's going to do when he gets command of Fort McHenry is he realizes the flag is not big enough. So he is going to commission the largest flag anyone has ever seen. And the flag will be made in Baltimore by Mary Pickersdale. She is a seamstress in Baltimore, and she is going to create this flag that is 42 inches by 30 inches. He wanted this flag to be so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. So most mornings, almost every day, basically at every American base or fort everywhere in the world, they're going to come out in the morning and they're going to put the flag up. And it's a ceremony. It happens every morning. And the same thing happens at Fort McHenry. So every morning it comes out and they put up this very large flag, which is the 42 by 30 inches. And they put that up almost every morning. So on dawn of the 13th, the most powerful navy in the world is going to order all of their ships to fire upon Fort McHenry. So the first thing that's going to happen is Fort McHenry is going to fire back. I mean, Fort McHenry has been waiting for the British Navy to arrive. They're prepared for this. They are very well trained, and they start firing back at the British Navy. The British Navy are like, okay, they pulled back just far enough that the American ships couldn't hit them, but they could continue to hit Fort McHenry. Next slide. So the British, I've seen different figures, but I'm going to go the British fired somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 shells and rockets were fired at the fort. Some of the mortars that were fired were literally 190 pounds. 2 shells are going to explode in the southeast corner, killing 2 officers and wounding several others. So this is going to go on for 24 hours. So the morning of the 13th, the firing begins, and it's going to last all day. And in the meantime, they have a flag that's up there. It's called the battle flag. So it's not the Star-Spangled Banner. It's the smaller flag that they have up there. and it is going to stay up all night. So during the night, this huge storm is going to come in, because of course it is, and I'm not making this up. This huge storm comes in and you can't see anything. The only thing you can see is basically when the bombs explode. So every once in a while, a bomb is going to explode, and you can see that this kind of flag, this old, torn, at this point, tattered flag, is going to remain. All of the lights in and around Baltimore have been shut off. And it is, again, it's a smaller flag. So yeah, it's this huge, it's a smaller flag that's up there all night. Now the storm is going to last all night as long with the bombardment. So it's pitch black, it is raining, and the only time you can see anything is when a bomb happens to go off somewhere close to the flag, and every once in a while you can see a glimmer. So you've got smoke, you've got rain, you've got really all you can see every once in a while is the fact that the flag may, or you may not see it, and then 2 hours later suddenly the flag reappears. The bombardment is going to last for 24 hours. And around 7 a.m. on the morning of the 14th, the bombardment has stopped, and literally the storm has stopped, and the sun comes out. You can't make this up. So morning of the 14th, the bombardment stops, the smoke clears, and the sun comes out. Next slide. In the morning, the U.S. soldiers will take down from the fort, as they do every morning, they're going to take down the tattered flag, and they're going to replace it with the Star-Spangled Banner. This is the largest flag that anyone has ever seen. They're going to put up that flag, and they are literally going to play Yankee Doodle Dandy. And the British are like, are you kidding me? Now, the British are under orders not to take the fort unless they are certain that there are fewer than 2,000 men in that fort. There are actually only 1,000 men in the fort, but they don't know that. But what they do know is that they can't take the fort, and they cannot take the city of Baltimore without inflicting enormous casualties. And that is something that they are trying to avoid. So in the end, on the morning of the 14th, the British leave Baltimore Harbor, and they're instead going to head for New Orleans. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about the Star-Spangled Banner. Next slide. Oh, you're right. The flag was actually 30 feet by 42, not inches. 30 feet by 42 feet, not inches. Sorry about that. So now we're going to talk about Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was born on August 1st of 1779 to affluent parents. He's going to graduate from St. John's College in Minneapolis. St. John's College is still there, and he's going to become a lawyer. On September 13th, Key and his partner, who is known as Colonel John Stuart Skinner. Now, Colonel Skinner was actually in charge of the exchange of prisoners. So he and Francis Scott Key are going to go to the British Navy and request the release of a gentleman by the name of William Beams, Dr. Williams Beams. Now, the story of Dr. Beams is a very interesting one. How much of it is legend and how much of it is real is still under debate. But what happened to Dr. Beams is he was in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, when the British came through. And so he kind of made a deal with the city fathers would basically meet the British and basically try to make a deal with them, and so they wouldn't burn their town. And so he said, we won't bother you. If you don't bother us, you can go right through the town and everybody will leave you alone. He said, okay, deal. But then there's this issue with the pig. So apparently the British were trying to steal a pig. The Americans were trying to stop them. So the British ended up getting fired upon. And so the British, instead of punishing the Americans, they couldn't figure out who it was. They went after Dr. Beams, and he ended up getting arrested because he had promised that the Americans would not harass the British. They did. He has now been arrested. So he is basically in a ship in Baltimore Harbor, and Francis Scott Key and Colonel Skinner have been sent to negotiate his release. They get an agreement, and they are ready to release Key, Colonel Skinner, as well as Dr. Beams, when basically the siege begins. At that point, they can't release them. They basically have to stay on the ship until, because they know too much about what's going on, so they have to stay on the ship until basically the battle completes. As a result of all of this, he now has a front seat to the siege of Fort McHenry. He has the best seat in the house. So he is watching when the 13th begins, he is on the ship and he sees that there is this flag. Great. And the idea is that the flag will come down and the white flag of surrender will go up. And that will mean that the surrender of Fort McHenry. And everybody's expecting this, especially the British. I mean, the British are just expecting, with this many ships firing on this small of a target, a lot of them are going to hit, and that fort is not going to be able to withhold this siege. So he is on the ship. He is watching them bomb Fort McHenry. And again, every once in a while at night, he can see that this flag is still there. And it shocks him every time because he saw it in the morning. Now, all night, he is watching it being bombed, and he's looking to see if the flag has gone down, if a white flag has gone back up, because again, that will mean the surrender of Fort McHenry. And it just doesn't happen. And all night, every once in a while, you will catch glimpses of the fact that this flag is still there. And then in the morning, they take it down, and he's like, okay, that's it. And they put up instead the biggest, most obnoxious flag anyone had ever seen. He gets dropped off, and the British float away. Now, that's how he saw it. And then he writes basically the poem, which is Defense of Fort McHenry. Next slide. So this is the Star-Spangled Banner. You have probably heard it. You may not know the story behind it, but now that you know some of the story behind it, what they are saying here starts making some more sense. So on the morning of the 13th, you could still see at dawn that yes, the flag was flying. And so proudly we hailed as basically the sun went down, we still saw that that flag was still there. And we could see it because it had these broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. And all night we watched and we looked for glimpses as to whether or not that flag was still there. Through the rockets' red glare, through the bombs bursting in air. And basically every time one of those bombs went up close enough to the flag, you could see that that flag was still there all through the night. So the question that he asks us, this generation and all future generation of Americans, the question he's going to ask us is, does that Star-Spangled Banner still wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? So the question that's asked is how much of this is romantic? How many of this is truth? And the answer is always somewhere in between. There is factual writing of what happened at the fort. So we know what happened at the fort. We know what the British wrote about the battle. So we know it was 25. We know that it was 25 hours of bombardment. We know approximately how many bombs and rockets were fired at the fort. We know from inside the fort they did not take down that flag at night. And we know that in the morning they put up a new one. So all of that did happen. It's not really in dispute. How Francis Scott Key interpreted all this is basically what he wrote for the defense of Fort McHenry. Very good question. Next slide. There are a lot of other lyrics. I did not include them. He has at least 4 other verses, but that is the first verse that he wrote becomes the Star-Spangled Banner, which becomes our national anthem in 1931. So you would think that would be the end of the story, because then it's like all romantic and emotional, but that's not where the story ends. The War of 1812 doesn't end with the Battle of Baltimore. The War of 1812 ends with the Battle of New Orleans. So we just have to keep going. So let's talk about the Battle of New Orleans. So a song was written in 1959, and it was called The Battle of New Orleans, and there are a couple of verses from it. And it was, we took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we met the bloody British in the town of New Orleans. This became a very famous song in the 50s and 60s of the United States. Yeah. Somebody knows all the words to it. The question is did the song have other words? Yes. So basically it was a famous song that existed at the time. And somebody put basically the song and the lyrics together. And then that became the Star-Spangled Banner. and then it was a popular song at the time. And then what was his name? John Philip Sousa basically created kind of the most famous music and lyrics of the Star-Spangled Banner. And then in 1931, it does become our national anthem. Yeah, I don't know if it was a great tune, but it's a very hard song to sing. So it was interesting that that particular song was the one that was taken and became the Star-Spangled Banner. We're going to talk about the Battle of New Orleans. And next slide. So the Treaty of Ghent is actually going to be signed on December 24th in 1814 in Ghent, Belgium. However, it is not ratified by the US until it has to be signed by the Senate. All treaties must be ratified by the Senate. That actually doesn't occur until February 15th, 1815. So was the war over? The wars aren't over until basically, the treaty is ratified by the Senate. The treaty could have not ratified the Senate. The treaty. The Senate could have not ratified the treaty. So in theory, the war was still going on, even though because again, just how quickly news came from across the Atlantic, it would take 5 to 6 weeks to get here, and which is really kind of then it was ratified. In the meantime, between the signing of the treaty and then the ratification of the treaty by the Senate, we're going to have the Battle of New Orleans. So in December of 1814, 60 British ships are in the Gulf of Mexico. And then about 1,600 soldiers have actually landed in Louisiana. So the Americans have a they're in trouble. They've got these very hardened British troops who have done really, really well in Europe, and they're up against the Americans, and the Americans have a hodgepodge. So the Americans under Andrew Jackson have literally 4,732 troops, and the American army is made up of regular army units, like 100 Navy personnel. You're going to have militia from places like Tennessee, Louisiana, and a few other places. You are going to have free men of color. You are going to have Native Americans, and believe it or not, you're even going to have pirates. So this is this hodgepodge of troops that are basically going to try to defeat the British. It's nuts. So what Andrew Jackson is going to say is going to look at this thing and he's going to be like, wow, yeah, these guys aren't going to stand toe to toe with the British. So what he's going to decide to do instead is he's going to create earthworks. So he's going to kind of find a hill, and he's going to take these cannons, and then he's going to create earthworks around all the cannons. So he's going to hold on to the high ground. He's going to put men next to the cannons, and he's going to basically say, come kick me off my mountain. And that's the only thing that was going to work, because if he tried to do column to column against the British, he would have been annihilated. So he basically took what he had, he took the terrain in which he had, he took the troops in which he had, and he created earthworks to basically protect his line of cannons and put the American troops behind it. As a result of this, in January 1st, 1814, the British are going to start their bombardment of New Orleans. Next slide. So on January 8th, the British infantry will attack the American line. Some 2,000 British soldiers will become casualties in 30 minutes, versus only 13 will be killed on the American side. So again, they're kind of built into a hillside. If you think of a hillside like this way, you've got cannons coming out of the hill, and then they've got a terrain that you've got to cross. So the Americans have made this dip. So the British have to come down into this dip and then have to get ladders to kind of go up to face the Americans. As soon as they hit the plain, all of the cannons open up, and open up they do. And it becomes a slaughter. One of the soldiers actually described it. He said, everything became red. And literally we thought it was blood, and then we realized that it was just the red coats. So literally they had fallen down on top of each other, and this entire sea of red, which was both blood and the red coats just lying prostrate in the middle in front of them. It was a disaster for the British troops. And you had these, hardened troops who had done so well in Europe, and yet they were sacrificed for the city of New Orleans, and they were sacrificed even though the British at that point had already signed a peace treaty. And one of the ironies of all of that is that therefore these British troops would be desperately needed at the Battle of Waterloo, and they couldn't make it back in time. So the British will eventually withdraw from Louisiana, and then almost immediately following that, the U.S. Senate will approve the Treaty of Ghent, therefore ending the War of 1812. So several people have put some comments in there that the Star-Spangled Banner was a popular English drinking song to Acheron, I think it's in heaven. And it was written around 1775 by John Stafford Smith. So that is the music, and they're going to take that music and they're going to apply the words written by Francis Scott Key, and that will come up with the Star-Spangled Banner. And then so the war will end it depends on who you ask, but I'm going to go with the war is going to end in February of 1815 with the U.S. Senate ratifying the treaty. Next slide. So these are my conclusions. You can agree with them, you can disagree with them. These are mine. So the question is who won the war? Well, if it wasn't the British who won the war and it wasn't the Americans who won the war, who did? The answer is the Canadians. The Canadians were able to withstand basically an invasion by the Americans. And they also kind of decided that they weren't Americans. There was an idea at the time, because a lot of the people who were living in Canada had immigrated from the United States into Canada. And so a lot of them were born in the United States, but they did consider themselves Canadians at that point, and they were not prepared to become Americans, and they weren't prepared for the Americans to invade and make them Americans. So then the next question is the Americans didn't win the war and the British didn't win the war, who lost the war? And the answer, of course, is always the Native Americans. So with the War of 1812, there was especially in the Northwest Territory, which is where Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin is today, that was still considered the frontier around the time of 1812. Ohio became the first state in 1803. But a lot of the area was still controlled by the Native Americans, and they were trying to get support from the British in order to prevent the Americans from completely taking over that territory. And with the ending of the War of 1812, the British withdrew all support for the Native Americans. And at that point, the Native Americans lost control over that area. So basically everything east of the Mississippi would now be controlled by the Americans. The Treaty of Ghent made it clear that neither the Americans nor the British are going to gain any new territory. And that's always kind of one of those, how do you know that somebody won or lost a war? Usually the winners gain territory and the losers lose territory. Maybe that's a generic way of thinking about it, but this is how we measure success in warfare, is who gets new territory. Neither one got new territory, so kind of neither one won. However, after winning both the battles of Baltimore and New Orleans, the Americans believe they have defeated the British. And they kind of walk away from the War of 1812, believing that they have defeated the British and they have won the Second War of Independence. And so they kind of walk out of this door with additional prestige, and they really believe that they have won the war, when in reality, they just didn't lose. You also have American military commanders such as William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson, who are going to become household names and will eventually become presidents of the United States. And that kind of concludes my presentation. If you can go to the next slide. I just wanted to say some of the other presentations that I have done that are currently available on YouTube. My most popular, believe it or not, is the Battle of Midway, which kind of surprised me. I think it's like almost 3,000 people have downloaded that one. So that's always an interesting one. My favorite is the Great War, the rise and fall of empires. I really think that is a collective, very interesting look at what was going on at the turn of the century and which empires survived the Great War. Somebody's pointed out that the slaves also lost the war. That's a very interesting thought. I never thought of them as winners or losers in the war. They were always losers because they were slaves. So yeah. Now the international slave trade is going to end as a result, not even because of the war, but in 1809. But the domestic slave trade is going to become very, very valuable in the United States. And a lot of people are going to be sold as a result of the U.S. now holding on and being very secure in all of the territory east of the Mississippi. Thank you. And I got it done in an hour and a half. I have been going way over in my presentation, so I'm glad I got it done in an hour and a half.
Not way over, just making sure everybody gets their money's worth.
There you go. If anyone has any questions or anything else I can try to answer, I think I missed some of the questions in the chat room. Sorry, I'm just looking at some of the questions in the chat room. Yep. Okay. Robert, do you have any thoughts that you would like to add?
Oh no, just thank you so much for this excellent program. And this war is something that a lot of people, including Americans, don't know a lot about. So really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us and educating us on this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, well, again, somebody else has pointed out, Louisiana Purchase wasn't enough. We then had to conquer, first we had to conquer Texas. So we had to have the Texas become a republic. And then eventually we went to war with Spain over Mexico. And that is that's the Mexican War of 1840. So that's going to be the next war. Somebody had a question about the YouTube channel. I think we can add something. I don't know, Robert, if you can add something about where the YouTube channel is located or its address. I don't think I've got that off the top of my head.
Yes,
or on my screen anyway.
Yes, stay tuned.
Okay, great. One of the things that I did have added here, and maybe we can watch it after we do the presentation, which is my favorite rendering of the Star-Spangled Banner, which is, of course, done by Whitney Houston at the Super Bowl of 1991. So I do have that YouTube if you want to add that. Oh, thank you. Robert did add where the additional YouTube, the address to his YouTube channel, which has a lot of fascinating information, as well as obviously my presentations that I've done in the past as well. Thank you.
Deirdre, do you want to queue up you want me to queue up the?
Sure, that would be great. It's on the last slide.
I'll do it at the very end because once I start playing that, I have to turn the recording off because of
yes,
copyright.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So yes, so make sure we're 100% finished before we do that.
Yeah. So Whitney Houston did do this rendition just in 1991. I believe it was that the United States Air War had begun in either just begun or was on the verge of beginning in January of 1991. But the ground war didn't begin until March. So there was a tremendous amount of patriotism going on in the United States as they prepared again for Desert Shield was already going on, but prepare for a Desert Storm to begin. Very good point, Patty. All right. I don't think that we have any more questions that are coming in. Robert, do you have anything you want to add?
No, let's queue up Whitney and then the Tchaikovsky guy.
Yes, the guy who is the most famous thing that comes out of the War of 1812, even though he had nothing to do with it.
Let's see.